to catch his sessions. We're very lucky to have him because he is so knowledgeable. If you do neurofeedback, there's a good likelihood you're probably using some of his equipment that he's designed and or built. He has over 35 years of experience as a biomedical engineer and a neurophysiologist. He's conducted clinical research and development and system design in evoked potentials, microelectronics, human factors, EEG mapping for epilepsy surgery, and neurofeedback. He's interfaced with organizations such as AT&T Bell Laboratories, Cleveland Clinic, and he's designed software and hardware for computerized tomography, automated radiometry, and automated imaging. It's not all easy to say, much less even think about. And he is the founder and president of Brainmaster Technologies, Incorporated. He's currently focusing on an automated neurofeedback system with evoked potential neurofeedback and low-cost quantitative EEG, or QEEG, for those of you who know. He's the current president of the International Society for Neurofeedback and Research, the ISNR. And Dr. Collura will be talking today about advances in brain imagery in vivo. So as he described it to me very kindly last night, it's an affordable office-based imaging technology to assist with counseling. The price and the concept was very, very interesting. So at this time, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Thomas Collura.
And all of you for this opportunity. So I hope we have an enjoyable and interesting hour here, a little more than an hour, to go over this new technology. I'm also a mental health counselor at this point, as yet another chain in a series of careers. And what I'm going to talk about is how these tools that we've been developing can be adapted for mental health counseling in a specific use. And why don't we just start going into the presentation and see where it leads us. Do I have a button to press, Carlos? Is it this?
Yeah, I think that's the one.
Is this also a pointer? No.
I think it does both.
Okay. So the topic today is neurofeedback imaging for mental health counselors. I was in Elvis Lester's excellent workshop yesterday talking about hypnosis as an adjunct to your scope of practice. And this is something we're very, very passionate about, everyone working within their scope of practice. So he asked, what other modalities are you using? Cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, EMDR, brief therapy. And nobody mentioned imaging of brain activity. And that's something that we're interested in changing. So to be a little facetious, I'd say how many here have access to a functional magnetic resonance imaging system for live brain imaging? I didn't think so. What I'm going to be showing is technology that really has equivalent value to mental health, but is 1,000 times less costly and literally can go into many, many offices. So there's increasing awareness of brain health and brain fitness as well-being issues for societies as well as civilizations. As we look around us, we look at people making what I call automatic decisions, reflexive behaviors. And a lot of what we as mental health counselors want to do is to identify and intervene in maladaptive behaviors. So how many have said, I really wish I knew what was going on inside my client's head right now? Okay, so we're going to be showing examples of that. We have quite a number of examples of clinical and non-clinical applications of literally seeing what's going on inside someone's head. We call it biofeedback imaging because it's based on biofeedback technology that is FDA registered, readily available, highly validated, and it's been extended now into imaging. So what we're using is EEG. Another question, how many of you use EEG? Familiar with EEG? Again, relatively small number. That number should be much, much higher. I appreciated the comments this morning about legislation and regulation and certification. I firmly believe mental health counselors should be able to use electroencephalography. They should be able to use brain mapping, and I'm going to be showing you the ways in which we're doing it that is not a medical, wet kind of science thing, but really belongs within mental health. We're going to understand the brain and talk about how the cortex operates and how we identify maladaptive responses and compare them with adaptive responses, and look at aberrations in brain processing that we can see, and explain how different interventions have effects on brain activity. So this can also be used to validate and explore all interventions. That's one of the more exciting things, is we now work with chiropractors, we work with different types of therapists. More and more we are working with hypnotherapists and social workers, people doing different types of interventions. So this is the fun part. This is where I get to be a philosopher for 30 seconds or so. And what we're talking about is the fact that the brain functions on a physical level. So we have this level P, physical, and P causes P star. It's a fancy way of saying a brain event caused another one. And we often would say, oh gee, the neurotransmitter release at one synapse resulted in an action potential across the other side of the synapse. This is physical causality. We try and operate up here in this mental world. And this is where, I begin to have problems. I work with offenders, for example, and other clients who have impulsive or reflexive behavior that's maladaptive. So you go, I got mad and so I hit him. Well, to me that doesn't make sense. I'm not going to buy, I got mad and so I hit him. What I want is there's a brain process that's giving rise to this emotion. And that brain process has some underlying purposeness to it. And it then gives rise to another behavior, a defensive behavior. Yesterday in the workshop, one comment was made, which I would strongly believe, which is thought is a behavior. How many of you would spontaneously kind of think, oh, thinking is a behavior? They seem kind of opposite the way we were taught, but I did see some hands go up. Thinking is a behavior, it's just that we don't see it yet. Actually, we do see it now. We see the brain activity that underlies this mental stuff. So when we talk about causality, the physicists in the room say that the physical causes the physical, and there are others in the room who will be on the mental realm, so the mental causes the mental. What I think is happening now is probably that it's not purely physical, but there's almost a flip-flopping here. I'm reading the book about Alan Turing. One of the comments he made is that at an instant, the brain, the mind may be given control over a minute amount of atomic power that could alter some behavior. So it's possible the mind can affect the brain under certain circumstances at certain instants, which is an interesting idea. So now we want to foster those instants. We want to foster that level of control. In the work we've recently published, we also looked at a social interactionist model by a gentleman named Haidt. And the nuance in his name is unfortunate. But what he talks about is the relationship between two individuals, person A and person B. Each person has intuition, judgment, and reasoning. And there are eliciting situations. Now this could be a couple responding to a stress, it could be a client and a counselor in a room, it could be two counselors, it could be a supervisor and an employee. But basically what happens is these individuals respond in levels that involve intuition, which is the immediate emotional response, then the judgment, which is a decision about what it means, what its context is, and finally reasoning, which is meta-reasoning or comprehension, where your brain is stepping back in several levels, whether you're aware of it or not. Well, we've identified the brain locations where this happens, and we can show images of this happening in real time. And if you then extend this model to two people, you now have an interactionist model that basically says these two brains are interacting in a way that I can define and look at, make sense of. Now, some of the background has to do with the asymmetry in the brain. Everyone is aware of the basic asymmetry in how the brain functions. People generally recognize the right hemisphere is more spatial and holistic and pattern recognizing. And the left hemisphere tends to be sequential and moving in sequence and being more logical. There's also an emotional component to this, which we're going to go well into today. And whether you use brain imaging or not, this model can be very informing. What has been established in the literature is that the left hemisphere tends to mediate positive responses. approach behavior, judgment that things are safe, whether it's your environment or a potential situation or anything. The left hemisphere is responsible for eliciting that positive feeling by interacting with lower brain centers. The right hemisphere predominantly has the job of identifying danger, things that need to be avoided, or things for which caution is warranted. And the interplay between these leads to an amazing amount of variability in how people respond and how people feel and think about things. So we're going to build on this notion that we have positive mood generating capability here and negative generating capability here. And we image it now using a brainwave rhythm called gamma. Gamma is 40 cycles per second. It's fast in the world of brainwaves. And it's with more recent equipment, we've been able to routinely measure it reliably and get good measures. So in this particular work, we're not looking at alpha waves and beta waves and delta waves and theta waves. This is done in gamma, this activation frequency. We also can separate trait from state responses. Trait being, what is this person's natural endogenous tendency? What is their neutral state? And it could be negative. People here who have chronically depressed clients. They have an overactive, actually they have an underactive left hemisphere. Let me be absolutely precise. 90% of them have an underactive left hemisphere. So they lack the positive response. And then you look at how they respond to stimuli. Does it make them less depressed? Does it make them more? This type of thing. We'll show examples of that. So I've just described this, and we are using an imaging technique called S-Loretta. It's a evidence-based mathematical manipulation called standardized low-resolution electromagnetic tomography. You don't need to know the details, but you can be aware of what the pictures mean and what they're telling you. This is the article which we recently had published. Dr. Zalaquette here is a co-author, as well as Ron Bonstetter and Saria Chatters. This is published in Advances in Mind-Body Medicine. And most of what's in that paper I'll be talking about today, but I'll be going well beyond and outside this paper as well. If you'd like a copy, you can wander over to the table, which is to your right as you get out of here, and we have copies of this for people to take with them, as well as other papers. So what we're talking about is an operational model of decision-making, emotional regulation, and mental health impact. So the words we've been using for the last couple of years is emotional decision-making. And I contend that all decisions are emotional, whether you think they are or not. And it's quite easy to prove that with a thought experiment, that even if you had overwhelming evidence that something was right, but you just didn't feel like you wanted to do it, you're not going to do it. And the other comment is, even in the face of evidence to the negative, to the contrary, if you believe you want to do something, you're going to do it. And we're actually going to put these two statements on a flow chart in a graph and show how brains navigate into these territories of reasoning, feeling, decision-making, and such. So what we do with this implementation is, all there is a small instrument, went backwards, a small instrument here, which is a 24-channel EEG machine. And it's FDA registered, it's relatively low cost compared to just about anything else of this ilk. And you put a cap on a person and connect them to the instrument, and the software and hardware together work to create a three-dimensional live image of their brain activity. And it's these images that I'm going to be spending the whole rest of the talk on, basically. What do these images show us? What do they mean? How do we interpret them? Okay, so imagine, if you will, in your office or in a assessment setting, being able to record a relatively small number of sensors from a client, and technicians can do this. This is not, again, it's not a surgical intervention or something that requires all kinds of preparation. And these types of images are forthcoming then for your clients. So let me just throw some interesting examples at you and show how this has worked. Client presented, the mother said she's ODD. The mother said, I also think she's bipolar. So I love when the parent waltzes in and diagnoses the child. So we did brain map on her, and we did some questionnaires. And based on the questionnaires, what she had was not ODD. What she had was a problem back here in her brain. And what it was is it had to do with memory, her ability to remember things. She also had a certain amount of issues here with social interaction. So no ODD. ODD shows up here in the cingulate gyrus. And it wasn't ADD, which shows up in the frontal lobes. So we got a kind of a different view of this young girl's issues. So doing the brain map, there we are. We see the exact posterior regions. These are posterior temporal lobe right there, which agreed exactly with the symptom checklist, which put her over here. And this was confirmatory that the issue with this girl was that she was forgetting things, and she had a certain problem with remembering things, particularly things in a social or interactions context. So I sit her down with the mom, and we did cognitive testing, and she did poorly on the neurocognitive memory test, specifically. She did pretty well on the others. So I asked her, do you specifically remember on a test when you needed to remember a word or a picture, and a few minutes or a second or whatever later, you couldn't remember it? She goes, yes. She goes, it wouldn't come back. And so I turned to the mother. I said, are you aware of this? She said, no. So I said, do you recall when you're working, when you're in your home, do people ask you to do things, and then, what happens? She goes, often I forget. And I said, well, then what happens? She said, well, then they yell at me. They get mad at me, and they start screaming at me, and I can't take it anymore. So I'm turning to the mom, who by now is getting a little misty. And so I took it the next step in seeing no mood issues in this girl, brain-wise. I said, do you wake up in the morning feeling belligerent and nasty and you want to be difficult? She goes, no. I wake up, I want to feel good. I think things are going to go well. And I go, okay, and then what happens? Well, people tell me to do things, and then I forget it, and then they get mad at me, and then they yell at me, and then I can't take it anymore. So what we did was identify a mental, cognitive substrate that was underlying what symptomatically, at least to the mom, looked like oppositional defiance and all kinds of other behaviors. Well, we did neurofeedback with her to help remediate that issue. And the very first session, she comes back and said, I asked, anything changed? She goes, yeah, I remembered a dream. I said, well, how long since you remembered a dream? She goes, about 10 years. So I said, okay, what was the dream? She goes, well, I was looking at my body, and I cut myself open, and I looked inside, and there were like these kind of bugs or insects or something in there. And the mother said, and I just said, excellent. And the mother goes, excellent. I said, you're perceiving something. Something's coming up. You're aware of something within yourself that, needs change and this kind of a thing. And so that they were able to take advantage of that step. It comes back, another session said, I'm remembering where I put things. I used to always forget where I put things. Now I'm starting to remember where I put things. Then when I really appreciated, she came in one morning and I said, how was, I think it was a holiday, it might have been Christmas or something. How did it go? It would have been way last year. Well, my stepfather was getting at me, and he was really starting to bother me, and I turned around and walked away. And I said, what would you have normally done? She goes, well, I would have probably fought with him and argued with him, and it would have been terrible like always. So I said, why did you behave differently? She said, I thought and remembered that I didn't want to wreck it for my stepbrother. So again, it's simple memory, it's mechanics in her, so she thought about that effect. Here's another client who came in, again, about 30-year-old, living with the parents and such, and amotivational. The parents just struggled. She didn't have a driver's license. She didn't have a job. She didn't really have any motivation at all. And in the brain map, we see that she has this, what we call hypoactivity, a lack of activity, in this region called the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is kind of like the guy in the tractor trailer who's driving it. That part of the brain that's running the steering wheel and the gear shifts. That part of her brain is not really very active. And on further inspection, we see this hypoactivity in the right parietal association area, which is responsible for social awareness, putting yourself in the context of your environment. So these are specific brain functional deficits that are connected then with her clinical presentation. So she also then, we pursued neurofeedback as well as counseling and parental awareness and such, and tools and habit changes and new reinforcers, all these good things. But again, in full awareness that this is what was going on. So what I'm going to talk about now is how we actually create these images And what we can do is what are called event-related EEG images. So you might say, you know, when I said this to my client, I would really like to know what they thought or what they felt. And, or when we flash a prompt on a screen or a statement. And I'm going to show uses of this in forensics, as well as in working with maladaptive behaviors, eating disorders, abusers of different types. We sweep out a little chunk of the EEG, and this is what comes off of that cap. And the little black box is basically a lot of squiggly lines. And we sweep out this little piece of time here, and we analyze it. And for example, here's a case. Oh, fortunately for you, this isn't as visible as it should be. This guy has a skewer through his throat, as well as another skewer in his chest. And I'm sitting here running the brainwave equipment. This is Dr. Eric Pepper. This is Dr. Howard Hall. And we're demonstrating a Sufi piercing. So the question arises, what exactly is going on in this guy's brain at the moment he's sitting there with these skewers in his chest? And you only have a small amount of EEG to measure. So we snap off a small amount of EEG, and we map it. Now we're looking at gamma. This is a three-dimensional representation. And it's 2D because it's on the screen. But our demonstrations show the rotations and such 3D. We also have virtual reality capabilities for people who want to go all the way. But again, this is hypoactivity. This is looking down on the top of the head using gamma, three-dimensional imaging. Who wants to hazard a guess what spots on the brain that corresponds to? That's the sensory motor strip. Remember when you took your neuroscience little survey course, if you studied or any of that, in particular in neuroscience, the homunculus, that little body that was like laid across the head, showing this is where your lips are felt, have sensation, and this is your hands, and this is your feet, etc., etc. That region of his brain is highly turned off through some unbeknownst mechanism. Also, this is the anterior insula and frontal areas responsible for conscious awareness. And he's kind of shut those down, interestingly. It's a very bizarre EEG, and these are at a -3 standard deviations. So this is at a 0.001 significance level. And here in the occipital area where awareness is also mediated, you see this selective turning off. So this was very interesting. So what we decided to do was readjust it so we're seeing those areas specifically. Now you're looking at an area of regions that are specifically those that are turned off. It's as if you're flying over London in 1940 and you're looking at where the lights are blanked out and you want to make marks there. So this is basically a hub of awareness. These neural hubs have been identified in the last decade or so. And so this shows that this gentleman selectively deactivates a specific part of his brain. Now that's as far as this research has gone. Think about the application to chronic pain or to other pain situations. We have an individual who can just quite calmly endure this piercing. And there's the brain pattern associated with it. So it begins to lend you thinking about it. And we do have practitioners who have specifically downtrained activity there for people who have that type of issue. Now we look at where his activity is. Where is the abundance now of brain activity? It turns out to be deep in these temporal lobe areas. This is alpha abundance. This is where the relaxation is. And then also reaching up into the motor strip. So again, you're seeing that he's soothing those parts of his brain through some discipline that he's acquired. But there's the brain evidence, the neuro evidence that it's not just a sideshow, but that he actually has brain activity making him unique. So let's take this into counseling, into a mental health type of context. Where are emotions regulated? Very interesting set of concepts. Most people are aware, for example, that vision is processed in the back of the head, right? The signals come in through your eyes, they go through the optic nerve, various places I won't bother naming right now, but then they wind up in the area, what we call Brodmann's area 17, primary visual cortex. That's where you see shapes and colors and things. But then information passes on further to turn it into things like spheres and shapes and staircases and all kinds of different visual concepts, and then lamps and faces and objects are processed over here. The emotional system is very, very similar, and this is a really important point. You have primary emotional sensation, the sense of an emotion, which is like the sense of color or the sense of light. That's in these primary areas right down here. Brodmann area is 11. But you also have emotional perception. And further than that, you have emotional comprehension. Emotional perception is perceiving the emotion. What does it mean? What is its context? How am I going to respond to it? And the next level of emotional comprehension is like just taking the next step behind that. So how many of us have ever said, just stay with that feeling? Okay, what we're doing is we're saying, let's allow this to express itself, but don't yet jump to the next level. Don't say, he made me mad, so I hit him. Let's do, I am mad. And let's now everybody's doing that anyway. What I'm saying is this is a neuroscience rationale, which can then obviously be supplemented with new techniques that reflect that and recognize that. So let's look at further examples of putting this into action. This is just a little description of how the brain image is shown. Then we take the sample, then we get the response image. So a neutral brain image looks like this. A positive response looks like this. We see it lit up on what is the patient's left. I will emphasize these patients, these images, the client is looking out at you. Okay? You're not looking in a mirror. The client is looking out at you. So when I say the right side of the image, I mean the left side of the brain. Okay? Similarly here, here's a negative response. We're going to see these responses to individual stimuli. You will literally be seeing these individuals display emotional and subsequently cognitive and behavioral responses to specific things. So here's a baseline mood state of someone who is basically depressed at this point. A lot of this data is from Ron Bonstetter's lab in Arizona. This is a highly accomplished person. And they go around in a mood state where the right hemisphere, which is looking for danger, looking for problems, is hyperactive. And as a result is probably dripping out negative affect to a certain extent. That might even be what propels this person, which is something we speculate on in our paper as well. So the question is now, here we have an individual like this. What's going to happen as we present different information? So in a questionnaire, she was asked, what are your favorite things? What do you like? Well, of course, chocolate chip cookies come up. I say it's an army of chocolate chip cookies out there today. Everybody, I think they're excellent, but I'm trying to avoid it. I need more of that, less of this. It makes her feel better, but not completely good. She's still a little bit negative, but the chocolate chip cookies really light her. You notice they don't elicit a positive mood. They just reduce the negativity. So what's the behavior? You eat chocolate chip cookies, and you keep eating chocolate chip cookies, and now you have a neuroscience substrate for a behavior that is placating a negative affect, but never really gets what they're looking for. Beer, this person definitely doesn't like beer, so even the mention of beer lights up this very extreme response. And sometimes these even seem a little funny. It gets to where you probably decide you might not want to put this on, let people watch you. Or it'd be a good party game. Okay, physical health results. This is someone responding to red meat. Okay, see how there's very little response? And she says, I don't eat meat. I don't care for red meat. Doesn't like the idea. Running. Oh, yeah. Running gives a uniform, elevated emotional response, but in both negative and positive tones. So she, like many people, says, I really hate it. But I like how it makes me feel. So you see her brain going through this. I hate it, that's over here. But I like how it makes me feel, that's over here. So when a person gives you these dialogues, often you see the dialogue mapped directly in the brain activity. Now this was another one that was very interesting. Another fitness expert, fitness professional. You mentioned fresh fruit, and she's kind of illuminated there. Again, very little positive, a very kind of small positive tone to her, but mostly negative. Body fat she reacts negatively to, and she goes, oh, people shouldn't be fat. Of course, I don't like, I'm a fitness expert. Look at me, I don't like that. So you flash the word obese people on the screen and her brain erupts. And you say, well, tell us about obese people. And she goes, well, people shouldn't be obese. Yeah, but you have more, is it the same as fat people? Yeah, it's the same as fat people. They shouldn't be obese. And we're looking at this saying no. So the examiner said, tell me more about obese people. And she goes, why do you want to keep talking about this? Go on to the next one. He said, no, there's some issue with obesity. Tell me more. And she, I used to be obese, and people made fun of me, and they humiliated me, and I swore I would never be obese again. And the gentleman says, and so how does that affect you now? She goes, well, I throw up. She was concealing an eating issue, an eating disorder. And through this intervention, through this awareness, we were able to, this individual was able to get that information. Which, who knows if it would have come out otherwise? Probably not, because she was coming for peak performance training, not for counseling. And then she had to get referred out to a counselor. She had come in for peak performance work. She thought she was there, to be more fit, all this kind of stuff. So it was an interesting turn. And I talked to Ron, who's a corporate consultant. I mean, he works with NASA and the Pentagon and universities and Fortune 500s. He's a corporate guy, This guy's fit for this job. This guy should be your CFO. This person, should be in sales, whatever. And he had this, okay, we'll find an eating disorder specialist who can refer to this person, help this person. We've had similar situations in other rather exotic issues. Now here's one: responses to language. Some of these are not so clinical in flavor, but they're very, very informative. So here's the responses to language of a native Spanish-speaking person who knows all 4 languages. And what they're doing is simply seeing the word for the language. They're seeing the word enthusiastic in 4 languages. So they see the word enthusiastic in Spanish, and look at that positive response. Nice. I don't even know what the word is, but everyone else down here would, of course. So she appreciates them. Yeah, oh yeah, enthusiastic. Great. English doesn't, not so much. It's a second language to her. Maybe she's not so enthusiastic about English. Who knows? Or what it means to her. French, a little bit. See, a little more, but not a whole lot. German just makes her brain crazy. Very interesting. She finds it difficult. She has evidently some other kinds of other responses to seeing that word enthusiastic splattered out in German. Just an interesting example, one of many examples we're building up of responses to things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Here's another one from a person who was, this is the same person with the depression. You mentioned sleep. She wishes she could get a little more sleep. Deep fried food she doesn't like. Again, the chocolate chip cookies makes her feel a little better. Smoking, a strong negative reaction. So again, these are now, and this is one of the things we're going to emphasize, these can now be ranked. They can be scaled. Everyone knows what a Likert scale is, how they're used. This is now an electronic Likert scale. So if you don't even, and you don't have to ask the person what they think. And I also want to emphasize, these are what I call preconscious patterns. Some people were using the word unconscious. I don't like the word unconscious. This is preconscious. This is the brain activity that leads to the feeling. This is the brain activity that produces the opinion or the judgment. So you're actually getting it before the client is aware of it. These are underpinnings. Again, with the eating disorder, it was the preconscious, even though she tried to block it out. Some people use the word denial or concealment. Again, good examples here. Exercise, dieting, being physically fit, really likes physically fit. Well, this one's dieting. The interesting thing about dieting, see the one on the lower left, see how it's lit up on both sides? And when you ask them what about dieting, they go, well, I know I need to diet. I do diet because I like how it makes me feel and look, but I hate having to eat lettuce and celery, and then I can't have this and can't have that. And the dual activity here reflects her verbal dialogue, her internal dialogue. is that she has a positive sense about it. She doesn't like it. See how there's nothing in the primary positive? She really doesn't like it. She likes how it makes her look and feel. That's reasoning. But on here, she's going, I don't like celery. I don't like lettuce. I don't like having to go to the grocery, blah, 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 blah. So when we do now the ranking, and we're going to start making little charts of where people's brain activity is, dieting is going to come up as one of the examples. There's a little box that I call dieting. And what dieting is, it's something that you don't really like it, but you know that it's good for you, so you're going to do it even though you don't like it. Now that sounds like a mature behavior. So what we're doing is we're able now to map a more mature behavior. And the contrast to that, which we will also point out, I call naughty, is where, there's some interesting ones. There's ones where you like it and you avoid it because you know it's not good for you, and that's also mature behavior. But then there are these contrary ones where you know it's not good for you, but you're going to do it anyway. And we'll see where those can all be identified. So, we're kind of jumping around, but that's the way we do it here. These are normal individuals now. We were asked by General Motors, did people see the McLarens out front? Aren't those nice? There's a bunch of Corvettes running around out here too. So we were very pleased when General Motors called us last year and said, we'd like you to come out to the track, test the new Corvettes. Bill's over here, he was part of this, and see how people's brains respond to the new Corvette. Can you do that? Well, nobody's ever done it before, but let's try. So they put 5 people in Corvettes. 2 of them were professionals, and we're going to look at their brainwaves. And the rest were not professionals, and we're going to look at some of their brainwaves. And what we discovered is how people's brains respond to the possibility of driving, the prospect of driving, and the reality of driving tells a lot about what's going on up here and how their performance and mood is. So this is Kelly. She's a fitness expert. She's kind of a guru. And they put her in the car, and her brain lights up depressed, right? She's depressed, right? No, she's not depressed. She's apprehensive. She's rightly scanning for possible danger, wouldn't you? She's going to go 120 miles an hour. She's never done this before. You see the electrocap on her head. It's having her brain monitored. And we're over in a tent in another part of this racetrack in Nevada. And it suddenly occurred to us, this activity here is not depression, because you need to know what the person is doing or what they're exposed to. So she's apprehensive, quite rightly so. After a while, she relaxes and kind of gets into the groove, and there's the brain activity subsides. She's no longer looking for danger. Her brain is no longer, where's this? Oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing. She's very relaxed now, and you see that in the pattern. Now, this is her pattern at the end of the drive in alpha. In this one, we are looking over in alpha. Alpha is profound relaxation, deep relaxation. Well, look what's in deep relaxation. That very part of her brain that was worried about what could possibly happen next is really shut down. She's very relaxed. And the other interesting point is all this excess alpha is where, again, the motor strip, the sensory motor strip. The part of her brain that is connected to her body is in a state of reduced alpha. It's activated. It's ready to go. So when we looked at this image, I was asked, what does this say to you? And I said, well, when there's an abundance of this, it means the person intends to remain still. It's a sign of relaxation. Any of you who do neurofeedback do SMR training or alpha training, it relaxes. She's the opposite. She's got very, very low alpha. So they said, what does it mean? I said, well, it means she doesn't intend to remain still. And they go, well, what are you talking about? Pulls the car up, rolls down the window, stick the microphone in her face. How do you feel? I don't want to stop. And they're, oh my God. She goes, what? Because this guy's machine just told us the same thing. So very interesting, the things you can get out of these that you wouldn't have expected. Again, this is non-clinical, but this is performance-oriented, kind of peak performance. Now here's another gentleman who's kind of another guru of technology, and this is his gamma. And you can see that his gamma is all lit up in the back. particularly the posterior cingulate gyrus and the visual cortices. That's where his activity is. He's not so much thinking ahead. And his behavior was concomitant with that. He was scanning and just, he was on everything. And he's a blogger, and he just gets every in and out of every little detail, and he's like, what's this control here, and what's this control here? And he did a really good job driving. So that was a unique pattern to him. That part of his brain is specifically activated as he's trying to stay in touch. In contrast to Kelly, who's like, I'm looking for this problem, I'm looking for this problem. So you see differences in individual styles. Both effective, both successful, but different. So here's Evan. This is his alpha, and you can see he's not relaxed. He's suppressed all of his alpha. So again, this is the state that he chose to be in. It's not surprising that this would be the case, but what will be interesting is when I show you a professional. Because a professional's brain looks very different than Evan, who likes fancy sports cars, but hadn't really been in one a lot. Here's Craig. This is Craig's activity in beta. Now let me tell you about Craig. Craig gets paid $10,000 plus per day to come out to your facility and drive your car around. And he does it for movie theaters and movie companies and professional racing situations. He stages stunts, where the cars go flying over bridges and land in crazy places. He'll stage those. And one thing Craig can do is if you say, okay, on lap 13, on second 116.1, I want you going 96 miles an hour around that particular hairpin. He'll do it over and over and over again. And that's his job. Very, very precise. His brain is such that everything is shut down here. He's not thinking about the future. He's not worried about anything. He's not processing memories. He's not trying to worry about who is he. He's not doing any internalized work. What he's done is he's got his visual cortex running and he's got it connected to his motor system. That's how his brain wants to work. So you see this natural distribution of energy to those parts of the brain that need to do just the job at hand, but not other things. Here's Craig at the end of his run. And this is a very interesting one. Huge amounts of alpha waves, big, huge alpha, all over this area. Those very parts of the brain that were fired up and basically running in beta, now big blooms of alpha. And this is a very well-documented characteristic of peak performers, that they can alternate from a beta state to an alpha state. And what we're seeing with Craig, who's probably one of the best drivers in the world, not only can he switch over from this beta state to the alpha state, but he does it in specific brain regions that are well tailored. So he earns the money. So here's the cycle, the way we look at it. Any system is either up at this low frequency, kind of sluggish, high amplitude, muddy state of behavior, which is delta and theta, sleep and distractedness, but also creativity. Let's not give it a bad name. Highly internalized focus. And then the system can move down into a more activated, lower amplitude, but high frequency state. And these states all have the same amount of energy, basically, but the system can shift back and forth. And what we see now is people who struggle with mental or emotional or cognitive difficulties, often you can identify somewhere in the brain something being stuck, if you will, in one region or another. And whether it's an emotional response like anxiety or depression, for example, or a behavioral response, whether it's verbal or otherwise. As I've shown in the example so far, we're always looking for either an excess of activity, which is tying up that resource and actually compromising it often, unless it's done well, like Craig, or a deficit of activity, where it's just not functioning, like we saw in a couple of our clinical cases. So this general model of concentration and relaxation, modulation of activity, and people hear and see about this in other contexts as well. You may know that you should take micro breaks when you work. For example, when you're reading, you'll have a natural amount of reading you do, then you take a micro break and maybe look back over it, that kind of a thing. And after a certain amount of that, you take another break that's, I'll coin the word macro break. It's a little more of a break. So you can't read solidly. Yeah, I can't anyway. For 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, at some point you got to go, okay, let's take a little bit of a break. And also, you can't do that all day long, and then you can't do that all week long. So the importance of alternating between these states is very, very critical for efficient and appropriate and flexible functioning. And a lot of the way I look at mental health has to do with appropriateness and flexibility. It's not inappropriate to be vigilant at certain times, and it's probably not inappropriate to have a negative affect. Despite what the TV commercials would like you think, that you're supposed to be like a wind-up doll, and if the first pill didn't work, take the second one, and by the time you take the second one, you will be a wind-up doll. It's not the way it's supposed to be, and mental health counselors know this. You need to confront the issues and the adversity and resolve situations and not just be anesthetized. So as we move this model forward now, we're going to get a little more elaborate into what the left and right hemispheres do, what the left and right frontal lobes do. So here's what we're going to do. We take this model that says the right hemisphere is spatial and three-dimensional and holistic and pattern recognizing, which is one of the two functions of the brain. By the way, the brain has only two functions. It recognizes patterns and it seeks goals. You don't know what those patterns are, and you do not know what the goals are. If you're lucky, they're at least in concert with what you think your goals are. So we'll go into that in a little more detail, but the right hemisphere is doing pattern recognition, and it's thinking in pictures, and it's thinking about the past, and it's thinking in space, and it's comparing your experience with what happened in the past, and looking for problems, and it's there to keep you safe, just like Kelly's was lit up when she got into the unfamiliar car, okay? If it's running constantly, that's not a good thing, but it needs to be there. So we look for a little negative affect. It's good to see that flexibility in a client. And it's looking for things like, oh, the last time that happened, or the right hemisphere says things like, I don't like the look of that, or every time X, Y, Z. It's trying to make generalizations because it's trying to make you safe. And if, for example, you're approached by an individual who looks dangerous or flaky or shaky, you're out on the street, something tells you, I need to get out of here, you better be glad that you know to get the heck out of there. I've personally experienced situations where just through sheer feeling, I avoid a situation and then discovered 2 minutes later someone was actually physically at risk. And I was able actually then to help. I called the authorities and said, this is not good stuff. And that worked out well because of that situation. So that's its modus operandi, and it pushes a button that says avoid or attack. When it gets down to the amygdala, the only thing it can do is say, bad, bad, bad. And it also sends the message over to the other hemisphere saying, think about this. So maybe someone wants you to sign a contract. You go into a store and they want you to buy whatever it is, washing machines or something, and the contract's in front of you, and you want to buy it but then your brain starts going, wait a minute. I'm signing something before I know this, or before I've done that, or they're taking my money before this or that could happen, and you begin to build the scenarios and modify your behavior. You either do it or don't do it. The left hemisphere has a completely different function. So I don't think of them as like A, B, I think of them as like apples and oranges. The left hemisphere does sequential, future-oriented scanning and analysis using laws, rules, laws of physics, laws of nature, laws of society, and anticipates consequences and tries to tell you that it's going to be okay, that it's going to be safe. Your left hemisphere is doing an audit to ensure that everything's okay. So one of the things I like to say when we're doing this is I go, how long does it take to fail an audit? Who here's been in an audit, right? How long does it take in principle to fail an audit? No time limit. All the auditor has to do is come in and find some alteration, some variation, and then, well, here's the thing, that's the end of that one. You know, like It's a Wonderful Life, where they couldn't find the money, and that was going to be the end of it. How long does it take to pass an audit? All day, all night, all week, because everything has to be checked. So your right hemisphere is busy trying to fail the audit, and your left hemisphere is busy trying to pass an audit. So one thing we immediately realize is that it takes work to feel good. It's not free.